It is my privilege and joy that we can continue our study in the book of Acts. And we want to look today in the confinement in Caesarea and Paul's journey to Rome. The mission of the Christian is the testimony in the service of Christ. We have seen that the apostles have fulfilled their call. They have been untiringly working with total faithfulness to advance the gospel, to advance the good news to the world. And even when they were put into prison, they had not a stop there. They continued to do their job, no matter in prison or as free agents. We have seen in our last presentation that the foundation of imprisonment is dependency on a creature. Trusting in a creature makes us prisoners. And we saw that Lucifer trusted in himself, and he took in himself in a prison where he could not come out except he would have accepted the light of God. But he shut it away, and so he is now his own prisoner as long as he will live. The fallen angels, they trusted Lucifer and they took themselves into prison, and they will be the prisoner as long as they live. Eve trusted the serpent and she took herself a prisoner. Adam trusted his wife and he took himself a prisoner. Abraham trusted his wife and he was a prisoner. Isaac trusted in his son and he was a prisoner because of distrust in his son. Jacob trusted his mother, and instead of enjoying that first birthright that he now got by deception, he was a fugitive. He was a prisoner. Moses trusted his people, and he had to get into the imprisonment of death. Elijah trusted Jezebel, and he had to flee for his life. And Peter trusted the Jews, and so on, and so on, and so on. We can see this one line through the whole Bible, from the first thing that Lucifer went on to think he's God. Since then, everyone who follows his step takes himself a prisoner. And without a Savior, no one would be able to come out of this. I hope we understand this is the original sin, or that what the Bible calls sin in singular. It's instead of trusting God, the only source where we can take the needs we have, we and humans trust in other creatures. And by trusting in other creatures, you must take yourself in prison and you must inflict upon yourself this kind of things. So we see that Paul came into his imprisonment because he listened to the leaders in Jerusalem to do something that made no sense. But did God leave his man alone? Did he let him go away? No. Paul, as a prisoner, becomes the preacher of a gospel of liberty. And this is the beauty of God's way to deal with our mistakes. He takes them and makes something good out of them. That doesn't give us a license to do the evil so that it might become good out, no. But it's in God's nature that He never gives up. He always does the best of everything we do wrong. And so Paul becomes a prisoner as a result of trusting in humans. But he has the occasion, even in this prisonership, to preach the liberty of the chains, of those inner chains, of that error. And this is the beauty. And I would like in this presentation, where we go through the last things in Paul's, the last journeys of Paul, shortly go through them, we won't look so much to Paul as to God as he leads all those things around. Yes, Paul does a mistake and is taken in prison, but God gives him the chance to preach before the Sanhedrin and before the day before his own experience in front of his nation there in Jerusalem. He is a messenger of God and he preaches in all circumstances. Then they want to kill him. They make a plot against him to not eat or drink. 40 men did this vow that they will not eat or drink until they kill Paul. I wonder if they ever have fulfilled that vow. But God is in charge of all things. So there is the nephew of Paul who understands this vow and this complot, this trying to kill Paul, and he comes and shares it with Paul. And Paul shares it with Lysias, the commander, and of course he takes the measurement to take him out of Jerusalem and brings him to Caesarea in front of Felix and his wife. And after 5 days he's there. The Jews come up from Jerusalem with their accusations. And we don't read their accusations because we know they're wrong. What I would like to emphasize is to look to Paul's way to defend. And we will see that he does not in the end defend himself, but he defends the cause of God. In Acts 24 from verse 10, then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the temple, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. For this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. This is an interesting aspect when we are called in front of a judge. And we will, as we are going to be faithful to God, we will go through the same history like Paul went here. And it's good that we learn from now on how to stand in those days. Paul, the first thing that I want to emphasize, Paul was accused without any cause. He had done nothing, neither against the Hebrews, neither against the Roman laws. He was falsely accused. All that, what happened, that all those accusations were wrong. Now, when we are privately accused for wrong things and judged, we might not need to give an account of that. But when we stand in front of a governor or of a judge, it is good that we know what to say, or it is good to know when to say something and when not. We find Jesus, when he is brought up in front of the Sanhedrin, he sometimes answers, sometimes not. In front of Pilate, he answers, sometimes not. In front of Herod, he doesn't answer at all. So there must be a clear understanding of what are we going and what are we defending. And Paul just says the truth. He explains the things that happened, and he says, I am serving a God, and I want to have always a clear conscience that I don't do anything wrong, neither to God nor to man. And so he says there, and in the end he defends the cause of God. And so we have to defend the cause of God. But God cannot bring us only then in front of this people to be judged when we are like Paul, having that trust. And Paul learned from his experience there very quick, because now we find him in no fear of men anymore. We don't see that neither before Felix nor later Festus and everyone he comes. Paul is a man in chain, but in mind free. He doesn't make any compromises. Felix listened, and Felix understand that Paul is without any thing to be condemned. He is accused wrongly. But, and here is his human dependency, his evil heart that goes after the humans, and he does not want to get into a conflict with the leaders of the Hebrew nation, so he does not release Paul. But he comes privately and speaks to Paul, and Paul presents to him and his wife the gospel. But Felix shuts his heart against conviction. But Felix has an interest in money, and he comes a few times to Paul and giving him the idea that he might buy his liberty. But Paul would never do such a thing, because he was imprisoned for no wrong thing. He was imprisoned for doing good, not evil, and he would not get in any compromise. So Felix, when he was changed to leave for Rome, and another took his place, he made a favor to the Jews, and he left Paul a prisoner, even though there was no reason for this. But did God forsake his own servant? For 2 years, Paul now was in prison. And here, yes, Felix, because he had no accusation against Paul and Paul was no danger, he let him quite free. He could intercourse with all his companions. He was in a certain way free, but he was bound to a soldier. He could not move as he wanted. But is this not God's good way to help his servant, to have his friends around, to not be shut away from working, but he could work even though he was a prisoner? Now comes Festus. Festus is the new governor, he's the new judge, and of course he does not want to get in conflict with the Jews as well. So in his trial, he finds the same as Felix, that Paul is guiltless. But he now wants to do a favor. He wants to get a compromise. And so he asks Paul, would you go to Jerusalem to be in front of the Sanhedrin? And Paul knows that there is death awaiting him. And since he knows now that Felix, like Festus, are human-dependent people, they won't go and let him free because the cause would be so. So he appeals to the Caesar. Because this trial must come to an end. And it would not come to an end after Festus, who knows, is come. And Paul would stay a prisoner. So he calls up to the highest judge that was there at that time, Caesar. And he says, I want to go to Caesar because you are not able to judge the case. Now that was not really nice to hear from Festus, because Festus said, okay, did you want to go to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. So that was a problem for Festus, because there was a higher judgment. And so now comes Agrippa and his sister, and they come to greet Festus for his way to be governor now, and so on. And Festus says, I have a prisoner here. Let's hear him if you want, because I have nothing to write down. He appealed to Caesar, but what shall I write down that I have him a prisoner? I have no cause real for keeping him in prison. And so Paul, in God's grace, great providence, has the chance to preach to Agrippa, the last king of the Herodian succession, and he does it as a free man. He has the chains, but he speaks freely. And he calls Festus and Agrippa to decision. And Agrippa says, almost thou persuadest me. But almost is nothing. Almost never will go anywhere. It's either to all or nothing. Now sometimes I think, was it a waste of time that Paul had the chance to speak to Felix, to Festus, to Agrippa and Bernice, and none of them accepted the gospel? Was it a waste of energy that God wasted on these people? No. We don't know how many others have been benefited that was around there and took the gospel for serious. But in the great day of judgment that Paul says that he knows that the death will resurrect the good and the evil to give an account, this man will have no one excuse that they did not trust God and came out of the error of their mind. Because God did everything he could. Paul was his best man at the time. It was his best servant that he could show to them the gospel. Did God honor this man? Yes, he honored them by giving them the message through the greatest he had among the apostles. And he could do nothing more. He could do no greater service to these people to save them. Fearful will be the judgment, because God did everything he could, but he could not take the decision for them. There is no compelling force in God to trust him or to take on the gospel and become free from the imprisonment of our self-deception. Paul has certain liberties, and God leads that as well on the way to Rome. With the shipmen, the occasion to preach to them the gospel, he becomes an advisor on the ship. Isn't that God good? His own man becomes, so to say, the captain of the ship. It's amazing when we see through history that whenever a servant of God was in difficulties, he never was the last one, he always was first. When Joseph was sold as a prisoner, as a slave, he became first in the house of Potiphar. When he was then put into prison, he became first in the prison. And when he became to say the dream to Pharaoh, he became first in Egyptian. This is the way how God puts his servants. If they are faithful to him, they will be everywhere first, no matter if they're in chains and humble somewhere. Through them, the influence for good is not stoppable. So the shipmen get a chance for the gospel. Now he's an advisor on the ship and says, let us not leave the beautiful havens. Let us stay here over winter, because we will get lost, the ship and other things. But they don't listen to his advice. But at least they asked him and they go. But it was good that he told them beforehand that something come, because that proves him a man of God. So when then the situation got worse, he was lifted up in front of their eyes and he could say, look, would you have listened? We would have avoid this. But even though you didn't listen, the God I serve sent an angel and he told me that we're all going to be saved. Paul prayed before he got this vision from God, because he knew he would get somehow to Rome, because God cannot not fulfill his word. He was secure in all those tempests. He was just trusting God, no problem for him. But Paul was interested in this ship people. He was interested to save them all. And God listened to his prayer and he said, I give them all to you. And so he rescues the crew of the ship and all the prisoners with him. So a Savior in chains. Isn't that a marvelous work of God? How God works through his instrument to save others, even though it looks like he's a prisoner. This is what impresses me. This is what I want to help us to put our trust totally in God. When we come into circumstances we cannot control, we just know that we can shine in those circumstances as well as in all others, which I might be better. Paul rescues the whole ship. But not enough of that. They land on Malta. By accidents? No. It's by the leading of God, because he leads the winds. He leads everything. Does he also lead the snake, the viper? Yes, of course. So Paul is bitten by a snake. And it's a poisonous snake. And the people expect him to die. But God, not by chance, let him bite that snake, because he wanted to lift up his servant in front of all eyes, who could give him an authority to speak in front of those men. And he had to do marvelous thing so that they would listen to him, because he was in chain. But now they thought he's a God. Now he had an open door to their hearts, and what he spoke would have another authority, like when he would have not survived that snake bite. And so he comes in the house of a wealthy man there, and the father of this man is sick. And what does Paul say? Oh, no matter. No, he goes and prays for him, and this man becomes healed. And so the news spread around, and Paul is a medical missionary on that island, and he can work for 3 months. Did you rest? No. A servant of God never rests. He's always on duty. He's always doing it right, no matter in chains or no chains. He is put by God to serve, and he will always make circumstances so that his servant can serve no matter what. And so Paul preaches the gospel for 3 months to the people, to the inhabitants of Malta. We don't know how many were converted, but for sure it was not for nothing. The message of God was given there, and people who trusted him, who trusted the message, come to trust God, were saved. And we will see that at the end, on the great day of Christ's return, we will see the result of that labor of a prisoner for 3 months on Malta that changed the whole island or the whole things for eternity to the good. Isn't God a great God, and how he deals with humans? Finally, they arrive in Rome. First, they anchor into that haven on the shore, and they are allowed to stay there for 7 days, because there is a church, and Paul is allowed to stay 7 days with them before they go to journey. He has time to accommodate, time to preach the gospel. And also the news goes before him, Paul is coming to Rome. Yes, he comes as one in prison, but the people come to greet him. And so as Paul walking, not maybe most joyous, because he didn't think he should enter the city in chains, this great metropole of that time, but about 40 miles before he arrives, the church people coming to greet him, and they hug him, and they weep with him, and Paul is encouraged. Yes, every time one comes to greet him, the whole convoy must stop, because they have to look to see how these people love the one that through his letters, through his message, has brought them the gospel of liberty. And then, since he is a prisoner, but no guilty prisoner, he can have a house arrest. He rents his own home and he can live there. Yes, with a soldier on his side, but he's free. He can welcome the Jews in Rome to preach them the gospel. He can preach even to the household of the emperor the gospel. He gets one chance after the other, and he can bring the gospel to Nero. And no one would have expected, after 2 years of working there, that Nero would set him free. But Nero found no guilt, because there was no guilt. And so the highest judge back then brought liberty to Paul, and he could leave Rome as a free person and go and work with the churches that he still had to work. Finally, he was imprisoned again with the accusation that he was the one that has put Rome to burn. And everyone knew that that was not right, but it was imputed to the Christians. And so now he returns, and we will see the end of his life journey in our next presentation. But back here, let us conclude the co-working between the Creator and the creature. God is the creator of all things, and he provides all means. A creature, or we as humans, are users and implementers of the means. We have no means of our own, but we were made to use them. For what? He creates everything for a purpose. Nothing that God creates has something to do, because he is the one that works. So everything he does to work, everyone needs to fulfill that through the basic law, to the fundamental law, take to give. It's the creature's active duty to fulfill his purpose by using the means that God has given him to do. Now, he creates beings with a spirit and without a spirit. And the beings that have a spiritual beings have the capability of self-controlling. God is not able to control their taking. They have to govern themselves. And so they are spiritual beings, act freely without coercion. That's how God made the beings that have a spirit, the animals and all those that have a spirit. But he also created spiritual beings with morality. Those creatures he created with morality, he assigned them leadership roles. So man was created into the image of God to have the ability to rule the earth, to provide all means for this earth. Take them from God and give them. So man had full responsibility for what God has given him. Spiritual beings with morality bear full responsibility for their actions. Now, the animals govern themselves, but they bear no responsibility because they have no capacity for introspection, for consciousness in the way like a moral being has. And so a moral being is always responsible for what he does. An animal is not responsible. He fulfills his duty. He makes what he has to do, but he has no responsibility because morality was not given to him. But to us as humans, and to the angels, and to all beings that have a spirit with morality, they have to bear responsibility for their actions because nobody can act for them or take responsibility. This is how man was created in the image of God. That's why we have to take full responsibility for what we do or not. And it's not on God's part. He will not judge us arbitrarily because he gives us all the chances. Felix, Festus, and Agrippa, and even Nero got their great chance to hear the gospel. Why did they refuse it? It's no explanation for that. But God will take them responsible. God expects fruit, the fulfillment of the purpose, and God will give the consequences because he controls the results. So as a conclusion, God is the one that controls all circumstances, and the creature or we control only ourselves. Now, and this here there is the fight, here is the battle, but because we as humans thinking we are God, we want to control circumstances. But we don't find Paul on the ship or everywhere we see him that he wants to control circumstances. He just controls himself in the circumstance. This is what we have to learn out of these lessons. Because all problems come because we want to go in that part which is only God's. We can never control circumstances. We have only the ability to control ourselves. And this is very important to know. So when I come into a situation where I have no control over it, I won't try to have. I will just have control over myself and I let the rest do God. Like we have seen in this wonderful history of the journey from Jerusalem to Rome. We see how God is in control of all the circumstances. The winds are under his control. The ship, everything is under his control. But he had to have a man who was in control of himself, who could plead with God, who could say, I want to save this. How can I do this? And by having control over himself, by not trying to contradict, by not trying to speak against, but just having that clear authority as a man of God, controlling himself, he could have the greatest influence for those people. And this we must learn. If we want to make a difference in this world, we must leave that which is God's for God. That's what we have a no to say. We don't go into those things we cannot control. We are just knowing our limits. Knowing our limits, we will only control that which is able by us to control, and that is ourselves. And by controlling ourselves, in every circumstance that God leads, he will put us first. He will put us somewhere on the podest that his light that is in us can shine. And we can have a good influence to shine in front of everyone. No matter in chain or as no chains. The power of God will accompany us. And he is leading the circumstances. In this last battle of this world's history, God needs men and women who have full control over themselves and will not try to control the circumstances, who let them be. They just control themselves in them. They say what is right and what is wrong, but they won't impose or won't try to control that which is not under their control. And having this clear understanding what's their duty and what is not their duty will bring them that they will shine in front of the world. And God will, through difficult circumstances, but he's in control of them, bring his people in to put them on a shelf, to put them on a big place so that they can shine. That everyone, when he sees the gospel of liberty, when they see that they can become free from the chains they have been born with, now they get the chance to be freed from those chains. When they see it and Without seeing it, they cannot respond to it. They cannot even see the chains. Then great things can be accomplished. People will take the gospel and others won't. But it doesn't matter. We will shine. And it will not be a wasted time. Neither while we be in prison or wherever we be. As we are faithful in our heart to God, He will use us in no means, in a very beautiful way. He will use us. Paul was never at rest, so to say, neither in his prisonership. He worked more there in Rome, in his arrest at home, than everywhere else. He wrote down things which he might have not been written, or the authority that he had writing under chains was much bigger, and it influences not only those people at that time, it's almost 2,000 years later, and it still works with us. This is how God works with His servants. Do you want to be a servant that is totally consecrated to Him, that has no other plans except to fulfill the mission we are called for? I want to be like that servant because I want to look back one day to everything I did under God's grace, to look back like Paul looked back and be satisfied because we have done and fought the good fight and brought to an end the purpose for what God created us. Amen.